So do you want to jump right in? Jeremy, my friend Jeremy Stewart is here joining us today, and he has some experiences that he wanted to share with us, or at least is willing to share with us, and regarding a UFO sighting. And so we'll talk about that, and then Jeremy, if there's any other paranormal type of stuff you would like to address, we can also do that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so it was fall 1998. I have been pretty sure that it was October 20th, but now thinking back over my story over the last few days, there is also a possibility that it was November 15th, 1998. Because these were two nights that I was at the Legion Hall with my friend Mike Tubbs, the Legion Hall in Prince George on 7th Avenue, the old Legion Hall, standing in the parking lot.
So that's behind the Legion Hall in the alley?
Yeah, it's sort of in the alley. Like, it's also the parking lot of the Coast Inn. So I'm trying. I don't know what they call that street now, but it's the one that runs past the Art Gallery, Canada Games Way, or something. But it wasn't that then.
Okay, I was thinking about the other Legion Hall for some reason.
Yeah, so this is the Legion Hall that was on 7th Avenue. So the parking lot was directly south of it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I can picture it now.
Excellent. Yeah, I am inclined to think it must have been November 15th because there was some ice on the parking lot. Yeah, it seems like quite a bit of ice on the parking lot. But anyway, I was standing out there. It was sometime after 10 p.m. It was just me and Mike, and we were having a smoke. It was a show that we had some role in producing. If it was October 20th, it was one that my band was playing. If it was November 15th, it was one that my band was playing, and also that I co-produced with Mike. So that's, again, another thing that makes me think that was the date. And we were looking east, in other words, toward the direction of the airport from downtown. But you can't really see the airport from there. Like, what you see is the cut banks. But yeah, there was what I think must have been a pretty large silhouette in the sky, a saucer-shaped silhouette, like tipped at 45 degrees, with a band of rotating white lights along the middle of the silhouette shape. So also at 45 degrees, if that makes sense, to the horizon. Yeah,
so can I ask you a couple questions about that?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so you've basically got your classic flying saucer shape.
Yeah.
And there's lights around the peripheral.
Yeah,
the
that's right.
or whatever. Okay. Yeah,
that's
and are they flashing in like a sequence around?
Yeah, they're like a line. They're like a line of spaced lights. So like white lights, not too big, probably at a distance where it might divide the shape 20 times, and that band of lights moves around. So like you can see 20 lights at any given time on a side.
Right. Okay, so that implies that there's probably 40 or 50 lights going around the entire circumference.
Yeah, and I mean, I didn't count them, but it's like,
right.
Yeah, but that's correct. You understand what I'm getting at there.
Yeah. Okay. So this thing is in the sky to the east of you. Is it when you mentioned that it's a profile, is it in front of anything? Like, I know you mentioned the cut banks. For anybody who's not familiar with Prince George, the cut banks are like basically cliffs that entirely surround the downtown area, and they rise, a couple hundred feet. So was the saucer in front of the cut banks or above them?
It was above them. I couldn't actually, because I don't have an easy ability to scale it against anything. Like I couldn't tell you exactly how far it was away, but it
Mhm.
seemed to be over the river or over downtown.
Okay. And what would it look like about the size of the moon from your perspective? Like in terms of,
Bigger.
bigger. Okay.
It occupied more of the sky than the moon would.
Yeah. Okay. How much more?
I don't know. I mean, the moon looks different at different heights too.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was, I mean, how big did it seem to be? I couldn't really say. Quite a bit bigger than a plane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A plane coming into the airport from your position would basically be a dot, a light.
Yeah, it would look tiny.
One flashing light is all you'd see, just the red light as it's landing.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not an airplane, even though you're roughly in the direction of the airport. And because I know a lot of times that's the first thing a skeptic is going to say is, oh, it's an airplane, or it's a weather balloon, or it's swamp gas. So I like to rule out these things.
It's definitely not an airplane, because I could see the silhouette shape of it, like the saucer shape, and also the behavior of it was not like an airplane.
Okay, let's talk about its behavior.
Sure. So when we caught sight of it, like when we noticed it, it was drifting slowly to the north. Yes. Oh, okay. Thanks, babe. Yeah, it was drifting slowly north, and it came to a complete stop in the sky. But the band of lights continued.
So if it's drifting north from, if it's east of Prince George and drifting north, would you say it was heading towards the airport?
No, because the airport, where it would have been already north of the airport.
Okay. Or so would it have been close to the pulp mills or farther out of town?
No.
Okay.
Close to the mills, maybe even west of the mills. Like, was how I perceived it, but again, couldn't really scale it.
Right.
I guess you know what allowed me to scale it to a degree was the crispness of it, because you start to have more interference from the atmosphere and from clouds as things get farther away.
Mm-hmm. Well, also just the fact that it had any kind of recognizable shape at all,
Right.
means that the farther it was, the bigger it was. So you could say, okay, maybe it was a mile away and really big, or maybe it was a kilometer or a half a kilometer away and not quite as big, but still big enough that you can. I mean, it's not like the size of a balloon or something like that.
No. It's large, but anyway, yeah. So it drifted to the north. It came to a complete stop. The band of lights continued rotating while it was stopped.
Okay. And was it still at this angle, or did it come to a more horizontal?
Stayed at the angle. And then it drifted back south, not quite to where we had seen it begin from, and came to a stop again. And then it zipped off north at an absolutely incredible speed.
Like Bugs Bunny Roadrunner style.
Yeah, like you could see I could see the streak of the lights. Like it was very, very fast. It was much faster than any plane.
Yeah.
But I didn't hear a sonic boom or anything like that either.
Right. Okay. So it's drifting, sort of just keeping low, like not super low, but relatively maintaining a altitude. Yep. And then suddenly takes off at this roughly the same altitude, or?
Oh yeah, completely horizontal movement.
Okay. Interesting. When I'm just wondering about the shape a little bit. So it's saucer shaped. Does it have any kind of like a bulge at the top or anything like that, or is it more like a frisbee?
It had a bit of a bulge at the top and bottom, like it was very symmetrical along its plane.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And we do see that often in, that's sort of a typical image, especially the top.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Did it do anything else? Like any other different kind of lights or beams or scooping people up or anything like that?
Nope. No,
Okay.
no sounds, no other movements, no other lights or other changes.
Interesting. All right. Is there anything else you want to add about it?
Both Mike and I saw it, and we didn't really describe it much to each other, but we did in later years kind of be like, oh, remember that time we saw that UFO? That was weird.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't. So I think that's my whole narrative of that. Except I will say that I always wanted to see one, and then
Yeah.
after having seen one, my feeling was that I'd like to see one again.
Right. So you didn't feel afraid?
No.
Did you get any sense of, did you have any like internal sensing around it, like intuition or any weird messages or no? So it wasn't you didn't feel like it was trying to communicate to you in any way?
No, not at all. I just thought it was, I thought it was a really strange thing to see. Like, it sort of perks up one's attention a bit, like, maybe if you see a car driving erratically or other things, it's like, oh, hey, look at that. Like, notice that,
Right.
that was really all. Just a really natural response on my part.
Right. So it's almost a little like if you see a car driving erratically, but you were told that cars were not real for the last 20 years.
Yeah, well,
There's got to be some. There's got to be some kind of, holy shit.
There was, and actually, we said I said almost exactly that. I think I said, what the fuck is that?
Right,
Like,
right.
it was, it was surprising. It wasn't just like, it wasn't like seeing a car driving erratically, which is quite unsurprising.
It was more like seeing an impossible object driving non-erratically.
Yeah, it wasn't like overwhelming fear or sense of foreboding or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I know you said you spoke to Mike about it over the years. Did he have the same sense from what you can tell?
Yeah, I mean, neither one of us made too much of it after it was gone. Like, we remarked on it and finished our cigarettes and went back inside.
Mm-hmm. Now, just because I know some skeptics will try to make an argument on this as well, your cigarettes, did they have anything strange in them, or was it simple tobacco?
Yeah, no, we weren't under the influence of anything except cigarettes and coffee.
Good. Okay. I mean, that's enough, I guess.
for
whatever.
We were unharmed.
Yeah, I think that the whole, I mean, obviously cannabis is not hallucinatory. So people who like to, I don't know, kind of use that as a, almost just, they're really just trying to attack the person of the, of the witness in this, when it comes to stuff like that.
Oh, sure. And yeah, I mean, what's amazing to me about that is that, like, witnesses can speculate, or not, excuse me, not witnesses, skeptics can speculate about those kind of things. But of course, all their evidence is imaginary, whereas the evidence of the witnesses is real. And my account is real evidence as well.
Right. Absolutely.
Right.
Okay, so that's excellent. I think, unless you have anything more to add, I think that section of the discussion is probably good to move on.
Sure.
I did want to, well, if you're interested, I could tell you my experience. It's not.
Oh. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and then I do also want to talk a little bit about sort of the philosophy of what this might mean.
Okay.
If you're okay with that.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, so when I was living out at Westlake, this was probably just over like 2 years ago. So I believe it was 2019 and early November, which is again interesting. I wonder if all the UFOs in Prince George always come in November. But I was what time was it when you saw yours?
It was after 10 p.m. before midnight.
Yeah, it's around so I was going to say around the same thing, 9:30 or 10. I had just gone to bed, and we at the time we were in our bedroom window looked over West Lake. So there's a lake. It's a kilometer and a half across the lake, and then there's the far bank, which is like mostly forest. And this lake, as you know, Jeremy, is pretty secluded. It's out in the bush. There's houses there, but it's not like a city.
Yeah, no, and there's no highway.
Yeah, there's no highway anywhere close to it. And it's early November, so it's very dark. It's been dark for 5 hours already. Nobody is going to be out on the lake at this time of night. And if you were, you're going to have a lot of floodlights and things like that, because you probably want to see where you're driving.
It would be extremely dangerous, but how would you, would the ice be thick enough then?
There's not, no, so this was before the ice came. So that's why I'm sort of wondering about the date. I don't know the exact date, although I think I did write it down I have it somewhere in a notebook, I think. But it was before the lake froze.
Got it.
But it was into the fall and winter, because it was during the getting dark early season. And on this lake, there's a couple of residents around the lake who own float planes.
Right.
And I mention this for the sake of the skeptics, because, you know, this is going to come up. So what are the other options? So, well, you probably aren't going to be flying your float plane at night either. There's no runways. It's really dangerous to try to land a float plane on a pitch black lake at night. Nobody's going to be doing that. However, so there's nothing going on in the lake. Nobody's fishing. I go to bed, and I'm sort of half asleep when I notice the strange lighting effect. And what I see is I'm lying on my side, facing away from the window. And what I see on the wall is these 3 bands of light going up the wall like this.
Oh.
Just like 3 lines going up. It's like, what? Weird. Now, my window did not have blinds on it. No window covering at all. So this is I don't know what could make these lines happen. Like a lot of times you'll see a line very similar to that going in a horizontal direction when a car comes around the corner and you've got just a crack in between your curtains. You'll get that kind of effect.
Sure.
So it was similar to that, but there was definitely 3, maybe more than 3. But it was like 3, I'm going to say 3 to 5 lines. And then they went up to the ceiling and then disappeared. And then again, it's the same thing. And then again, same thing. So 3 or 4 times it happened. Probably 3 times, I think. So of course I'm like half awake, and I'm like looking at this going, what is happening? That's weird. And it took me a few seconds to realize just how weird that was, enough to jump out of bed. So I jump out of bed and I look out the window, and there's nothing. And there's no boats. There's nothing with any kind of light. There's not a spotlight on the other side of the lake. There's not an airplane. And it's completely silent, like you said as well.
Mm-hmm.
When the float planes take off on that lake, it is very loud. You can hear it from the complete opposite end of the lake. And usually when they do, well, the two people who have the float planes live pretty close to the house that we were in. And so they would have been within 500 feet. It would have been very noisy. So it wasn't that. And there were no boats. And even if there had been a boat, there was only a matter of maybe 5 seconds between when I stopped seeing the lights and when I looked out the window. Even call it 10 seconds. A boat can't disappear in 10 seconds. I've got a huge, like the view out this of this lake is very, very wide spanning.
Yes,
it would
panoramic of that house.
Yeah, exactly. So it would take about a minute for a boat to disappear out of my frame of reference.
Yeah.
So when people ask me if I saw a UFO, I don't really know what to say, because I didn't see a UFO, but I saw the lights that had to have come from a UFO.
Yeah, you saw some inexplicable lights for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And I've run through a few simulations of it on paper, because thinking about whether such an object would be hovering above the water, or if it was down near the water, or if it was a boat. Like, let's say, forget about the noise problem for a second. Let's say it was a boat. How would that work? And I've run several different simulations of it, and including the idea that that lights were bouncing off the lake,
right,
and then reflecting up to my window, which is totally possible, because that happens generally in the early morning. The lake is so still that you will literally get the sun shining off the water straight through the window with almost no ripple.
Quite weird.
Yeah. So
okay, but obviously that was not happening in
there was
November night.
It wasn't the sun.
Right, but also the pattern of light doesn't sound like anything familiar.
Yeah, I can't think of what would cause a pattern like that. If I had blinds on my window, then I could easily write it off.
Or more easily.
Yeah.
You're still talking about a bright light not associated with the sound.
Yeah, true.
In the middle,
but it could have been
lake.
Somebody in a flashlight. It could have been a burglar with a flashlight in my backyard.
Oh yeah, I guess
if I had blinds, but not without blinds.
Was it white light?
It was, well, yeah, I'm gonna say white. It wasn't like, it didn't seem super bright, but then again, I'm really far away, so there would have been some diffusion.
How do you know you were far away?
Well, that's a good question. Okay, so the house is about 50 feet from the lake.
Mm-hmm.
And then if the light was bouncing off the lake, it would have had to have been bouncing somewhere between 50 feet and a kilometer and a half, which is approximately a mile away. So between 50 feet and a mile is the distance of the source of the light, or at least the bouncing of the light. But if it was bouncing, it could have been miles away.
Yes, and then though it would have to be really bright.
Yeah, it would. So that's my story.
Scattering and atmospheric particles would have gotten rid of it by then.
Mm-hmm. And how would it maintain that 3-band structure at such a distance?
That seems like a pretty focused light.
Yeah. Like, so to me, I think the most, in terms of just the physicality of how that light entered the room, it seemed most likely to me that something was almost right outside my window and sending in discrete scanning beams, like they were watching or something. Which again is something that I've seen in a few recreations of other people's experiences. But I don't know how much stock to put into some of those, because some of them were like obviously fictionalized.
Sure.
But yeah, it is strange.
I've never heard an account just like that. I thought I might mention just the faintest details of my uncle's accounts, if those are interesting to you.
Absolutely.
My two uncles on my mom's side have each seen UFOs. One of those uncles has seen more than one. And
separate occasions.
Yeah.
Okay.
They were all, I believe, connected to Silver Lake near Duncan, BC.
Uh-huh.
And all I remember of the accounts is that one of them involved seeing a triangular ship with rounded corners that was pretty large and quite high off the ground, seeing it from the back of a moving truck. But it was, it was clear and not too far away. And it had rainbow colored lights all around it. But it was almost like windows on the edges.
Okay. That reminds me a little bit of the Phoenix lights. Have you heard of that?
No.
Okay, so there's actually triangular UFOs are sort of a thing, and a lot of times they tend to be like V-shaped with a notch in the back, or we're sort of putting our own assumptions onto craft design when we say such things.
Sure, but what you're describing sounds a little bit like a stealth bomber.
Yeah, very much so. So we do, shit. It's gonna tell me, okay, we have 10 minutes. Usually they just extend this thing, but they might actually cut me off this time. Anyway, if I need to, I'll just make a separate meeting.
No problem.
So yeah, with these triangle ships, yeah, it's generally like a flying V, almost looks like a flying V guitar. And along the leading edges are usually pink lights, just as you described, with along the thin edge, there's a series of lights, and then generally the top and bottom surfaces, which are the large surfaces, are just black.
Yes, this is different than that from what I recall of that description. Oh, I feel like I should also tell you about a dream I had, Ken.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mind.
For sure.
Okay, so this is a dream I had, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago or so, when I lived in White Rock proper before moving to Surrey.
Mm-hmm.
And what I dreamed was that I was someone else, like I don't know who I was, and I had found this metallic object somewhere near a farm. And the metallic object was like a bent piece of metal, not very big, but it was some kind of warp drive.
Oh.
And how it worked was by somehow concentrating a power that we would experience as like moral or spiritual evil, and that the power that it had was so immense that even when it wasn't in operation, just being around it would corrupt people. Yeah, that it was. It caused something like bad luck and destruction of people's moral integrity, but it was like some kind of profound negativity that allowed this thing to function, and the creatures who had created it, which were not human, were looking for it, and they got it. And they were not nice, because their whole sort of way of life and civilization had been reoriented around both using and somehow containing this this unbelievably nasty power.
Wow, that's almost Lovecraftian.
I guess so. Yeah, yeah. I suppose it is.
Okay, so this brings up sort of another point, because when we're talking about dreams, where is this? Is it information? Is it just imagination? And I don't even like to use the words just and imagination together at all, because imagination is really the fuel that has allowed us to get where we are today. But there's this idea of thoughts or ideas coming from somewhere. So are dreams coming from an external source, or are they generated from within somehow? And I think that's a fascinating question, and I have no idea if there is an answer to that, or if they're both true.
Well, I can tell you a bit about that, because that's part of my dissertation. So in short, in the West, over 25 centuries or so, the paradigmatic accounts of where these things come from are pretty limited. Like, what causes dreams? What are they for? What do they do? Are there different types of dreams? Classical philosophers, like ancient Greeks, thought that, like Aristotle thought that dreams were either sensing something at a distance, maybe, because your sensory organs could be so sensitive that you're picking up something at a great distance
Like
without
a remote
realizing
viewing?
it. Well,
Like,
yeah, but more natural than that. That
okay.
just your senses, because you were asleep and they had no other object, were able to pick up things that otherwise you wouldn't notice.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, or like slight vibrations over a great distance. And he thought that possibly there were some kinds of dreams that were from the gods, but in his view, they would only come to people whose minds were, quote, like an empty desert.
Mm.
And
In a good way, or
bad,
yeah,
in
no.
a bad way. He goes
Okay.
through a whole description on why those kind of dreams don't seem to come to people who are the wisest. That if the dreams were communications from gods, really we ought to think that they would come to the wisest and those who best understood the gods, but
Right.
that doesn't seem to be the case.
Well,
Instead,
that's Aristotle's. That was Aristotle saying, "How come I'm not getting any dreams? Must only be for dummies."
probably, yeah, and I mean, but it's really like, for Plato is not very interested in dreams either. He generally treats them as evidence that the senses as a source of information are deficient in and of themselves, because what they present us with is illusions. And that remains the view of philosophy over that whole period of time, basically up till the 19th century. And but the popular view, I mean, like if you look...
Before you move off of that,
Sure.
Can I say that this really reeks to me of the what's known as the Fermi Paradox, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Yes.
In which Fermi states there must not be aliens because where are they? Which is essentially the same as Aristotle saying, well, I didn't see it, so it must only be for idiots.
Sure, there's a lot of stuff like that, and many people who believe that they are empiricists adopt a view like that about many things. You know, I'm sure glad that that eventually people dropped that kind of thinking around radiation, because before we had the ability to detect it as such, we had the ability to detect its effects. And that was what led us to keep searching for it. There are other things whose effects we can detect that we do not yet know the cause of, and which we keep searching for if we are empiricists.
Right. Well, what about germs?
A perfect example, and viruses even after germs.
Yeah. I mean, the Victorians thought you were an idiot if you washed your hands in between examining a cadaver and giving birth.
Like, yeah, doing a Yes,
doing
that's right. Doing
doing a C-section
birth,
or
yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and there, you know, there's a lot of that kind of thing. But to just return to the sort of survey of dreams, um, there's actually a lot in Barakot 55b in the Talmud, which is the Talmud dream book. So this is like Second Temple period stuff, a collection of legal opinions. I don't know how familiar you are with the Talmud.
well, so we're talking about like what, 500 BC?
Yeah, I think that the Babylonian Talmud is that old.
Yeah.
And it's like between 500 and 100 kind of thing.
Right.
But so in that book, representative opinions are sort of like there's the nice one from Hizda, which is he says something like, a dream is like a dream unexamined is like an unopened letter from God. So the idea is that dreams are from God, and of course there's a whole typology of dream types from God or not in the Old Testament. So there are dreams in which God appears, which are called theophanies. There are the examples of the pre-Jewish practice of what they call dream incubation, where the Near Eastern people pre-Judaism had a number of practices related to seeking dreams from gods, which may be where the Jews get that idea as well. And how you could, if you sleep in the temple, you can plant the seed of a dream from God, so to speak, or from a god. Yeah. So in that section of the Talmud, they also go through saying like, for any dream, I can't remember which rabbi this opinion comes from, but for any dream, no matter how inspired, not every single part will come true, and a dream, no matter how uninspired, it's not that there will be nothing of any value in it. And they talk about that as the relationship between wheat and chaff, right? Wheat has to have some chaff.
Right.
And you have to separate out what are the good parts of the dream that will come and which ones aren't. But they also had practices through the centuries related to paying dream interpreters, and that's something that is denounced or treated very critically in the Talmud, because the dream interpreter just tells you what you want to hear, is sort of the idea. And
I guess there's always scammers, but isn't that essentially what Joseph was, and Daniel, and probably a few others?
Joseph and Daniel are the big ones. And it's interesting with Daniel because it's very, very explicit in that book that dream interpretation that is sound doesn't come from understanding literature and symbols, although he does. It comes from God. So that's why he's able to pass the king's first test, where the king won't even tell the dream that is to be interpreted. The interpreter's supposed to know the dream without hearing about it from the king and give the interpretation. So Daniel prays in order to get that. And then when he succeeds, the king wants to reward him. And Daniel says, no, I got that from God.
Right. So this is very analogous to the Christian, more modern Christian traditions of how to interpret prophecies and how to even do what do you call it? Speaking in tongues, and having words or whatever, where it's like one person speaks in tongues and then a second person has to interpret it. And both of these stages are seen to be essentially directly God speaking through both of these people.
Yeah, and I'm just going to write that down really quick because the gift of tongues and gift of interpretation,
right,
is a pretty interesting thread for that, because Daniel also does not interpret his own dreams. So he interprets the king's dreams, he interprets the writing on the wall, he does not interpret his own dreams an angel or a quote watcher, and it's the only place in Jewish
canon.
scripture. Yeah, it's the only place in the canon where an angel is referred to as a watcher. But there are non-canonical, pseudepigraphal, others books that are from, like there are some from the Qumran community.
The Book of Enoch comes to mind.
Yep. So there's other materials that talk about watchers, but that's the only canonized mention of a watcher as an angel. Daniel is kind of an odd duck of a book for a couple of reasons, but that's one of them.
Yeah.
Daniel also is the only book, I believe, in the canon that uses the word pesher, the Aramaic word pesher, to mean interpretation. And it does it through the whole Aramaic chunk of Daniel, chapters 2 to 6. And
is that the only use of that word? Like, so it's hapax legomena in terms of only appearing in the book of Daniel with no other context for it?
No, because it's also one that gets used a lot in the Qumran community.
Okay.
So Daniel's kind of a bridge to that community in terms of the existing body of writing that we have. But they use pesher in a way that's really strange. They use it to refer to a particular type of exegetical interpretive practice that relates everything that's happening in a piece of scripture to a current apocalyptic prophecy. So
just let me see if I understood what you just said. So they're using a method of interpreting scripture as everything they are going to read in the scripture is applicable to now and to current events.
Yes, and particularly to current apocalyptic events.
Right. Such as, oh, this guy's going to be president next year, and will end the world. This is not uncommon among evangelicalism as well currently.
Yeah, they talk about it. The Qumran community is particularly concerned about what is going to happen to their own teacher. I can't remember what they call him, teacher of something. And he was like the leader of that community. And it's like they're creating a bunch of these pesher interpretations of scripture that show what will be the fate of the Jewish world and of their leader and so on. And it's very apocalyptic in tone. So and it's just this word pesher that really unites them to mean interpretation. But of course, Daniel is also the first example of an apocalypse in the Jewish literature, because the apocalypse prior to that is a Greek genre.
Now, remind us again, what does apocalypse actually mean? Because I think commonly we tend to think of it as it has to do with world-ending war, but that's not literally what that word is literally like transcribes to. Isn't it something more like hidden meaning or something like that?
Yeah, that's right. Apocalypse has to do with something hidden, and it often does have to do with the revelation of an eschaton, which is like, basically the end of our world. Although it's interesting that in Jewish and Christian eschatology, there is always something that comes after the end. So it's never an end in the sense that there will simply be nothing after that, because God continues after the end. Consciousness of someone other than God continues after the end. There's some kind of place where we are, even if it's not in a material sense at all. So eschaton is kind of a strange way of looking at things too. But apocalypse is really, that word we should understand to mean a literary genre that there are quite a few examples of in and outside of the canon, but that sort of emerges in the Greek literary world, also roughly around the Second Temple period. And that because, of course, the Second Temple period is also a time of Greek domination of Israel. So it does make sense that there would be, well, I mean, the idea that the Jews, like many of the upper class Jews, became Hellenized for that reason. That is, they started to adopt Greek habits of dress, Greek language, Greek cultural manners and practices, in some cases Greek religion, or to syncretize aspects of Greek religion with Jewish religion. And actually, that is very much the scene that the Christian Messiah steps into.
Right.
Yeah, but controversies over who would be the head priest were exacerbated under the Seleucid reign, which is a Greek dynasty, and this is actually the context for the composition of the Book of Daniel, if not for its setting.
Okay.
Because Daniel predicts a bunch of events that happen. But it seems to have been what they call an ex eventu prophecy, in the sense that, like, it's set in 600s BC, but it almost definitely was written in 200s BC.
Okay. So they might have been backdating and retconning some things.
They were retconning some things to make it look like they'd have privileged knowledge of the future.
Right.
But they also, there's a point after which it stops being correct, and that's part of how modern scholarship dates it, is because, like, they knew, for example, that what's his name, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who was was the Seleucid king who became ruler of Judea for a period of time. They knew about him and that he would come to power, but they did not actually correctly, in the Book of Daniel does not correctly predict his death. He died another way than what it predicts. But
that implies that it was written before he came to power, after he came to power, but before he died.
That's right. So it was written out of this crisis that came about from Antiochus fooling with the system of selection of the chief priest. And he also, he did a bunch of stuff, like he ended the daily temple sacrifices, and he profaned them with a sacrifice to Jupiter and all kinds of stuff like this that caused a real crisis for the Jews, a spiritual religious crisis. And it's also familiar to us from the story of the Maccabees. But this is like the crisis that Daniel was very likely written out of, or at least that's the consensus in modern scholarship, excluding sort of a conservative fringe.
Right. So I guess what we can take from all of this is, in your opinion, would it be safe to say that dreams are not necessarily a reliable means of predicting what's going to happen?
Well, I think we all have an experience of that. I think it's likely enough that different kinds of dreams come from different sources, because this is something that has been experienced over the centuries. Oh, I should add, in the 19th century, with the rise of psychoanalysis, Freud's big addition to philosophy and to science was to theorize an unconscious. Now, those ideas already existed, but he was the first one to sort of make them scientific ideas. Before that, they were philosophical ideas in the hands of someone like Nietzsche. But the idea that dreams come from a part of ourselves that we don't have ordinary waking access to, that is nonetheless there and active in our behaviors.
Which is a super weird concept, but it does appear to be true.
Well, we definitely know that there are parts of the brain that are doing things that we're not aware of. Like, we don't have a conscious awareness of various autonomous functions. We don't have to think about keeping our hearts beating. And the brain governs these things. The nature of those unused or unself-accessible parts of the brain or functions of the brain is still very much a matter of debate. Post-Freud, the way to approach that, especially on the question of sleep and dreams, was to monitor brain function and create experiments that, rather than relying exclusively on self-report, relied on new technologies that allowed us to observe the effects on the body and then correlate those or contrast those with self-report.
Right. So because really we only have access to the topmost and the bottommost layers of some kind of multi-layered system that appears to be happening, and we have no access to whatever's happening in the middle.
I think it's okay to leave anything that we can't observe untheorized to a degree. You know, if we can acknowledge that it's there and say it's untheorized, like a lot of people now say, well, the parts of your brain that you don't use, you really just don't need them, and they don't do anything. They're like a backup system or extra capacity. I don't really have a strong opinion about that. We know that the areas of the brain theory for functionality in the brain are not much good. Like areas of the brain are not as clearly delineated as people have liked to suggest. And I think that,
No.
yeah,
No, that's not really what I meant. I guess what I'm getting at is there's a software layer that is acknowledged by the user.
right.
Then there is a hardware layer upon which stuff happens, to our very limited understanding, but we at least can stick a probe into it and see something.
Right.
And then I believe that there are layers of abstraction of firmware and various layers of operating systems and other programs and software, if you can think about it that way, that is similar to essentially if we were to take my laptop, I can see what's the screen is displaying to me, and if I go to a very hardware level, I can tell that it's plugged in, and if I unplug it, there might be a spark, and everything in between is a black box. And that seems to me where we're at with dreams.
Yep, I'm now I'm with you. Yeah, I think that's essentially right. Although, okay, here's another one. Actually, in the early 20th century, there's a British, well, I want to say philosopher. Really, he was a writer and kind of a bit of an oddball. He designed a fly fishing technique. He was an aeronautics engineer. A guy named J.W. Dunn. I would say a man after your own heart, Ken.
Yeah.
But J.W. Dunn wrote a book called An Experiment with Time that was very, very influential. It was a bit of a fad. And what it had to do was testing his own precognitive dreams.
Oh, okay.
And he had sort of a not terribly rigorously scientific approach to it, but that nonetheless was a scientific approach which came out of and in turn informed a very elaborate and heavily diagrammed philosophical approach. So I would say look up J.W. Dunn's Experiment with Time, maybe on Library of Genesis or something, and you'll find it right away. It was very, very popular. The third edition is the edition to find, which was published, I think, in 1957. The earlier editions are much earlier, but later in the later editions, he writes quite a bit more onto it by means of like providing a refutation for skeptics and improving his diagrams and so on. So
that sounds good. I have here another book on time. So I don't know if you've seen this book.
I have not.
It looks to be pretty interesting. And I'm currently in discussion with a couple of other guys around some new theories as well. So I will be doing a deep dive into time theory in sometime in the near future. But
well,
I
let me know how
cannot yet
that
predict
goes.
when.
Yeah, very good. I'm very interested in time. Dunn is interested in precognitive dreams, which is also how I came across Dunn, and you know, how it's possible to dream the future. And again, the question is if it's not already there in some way.
Right. So have you had any direct experience with that?
Voluminous, extremely frequent.
Could you share a couple of highlights?
Oh, well, I can just tell you what the phenomena is like for me. The way I describe it is going to make it sound like paramnesia, though, you know, which is fine. I know what I'm talking about. you know, I don't necessarily need to convince anyone else. But the experience for me is of a feeling a bit like of deja vu, what people call deja vu, where you know you have this sensation that you've seen something before, or that you know you're acting out something that you've experienced before. I've been getting that ever since I was a little kid. Only I can often remember other parts of the other details of where I've dreamed that, other parts of the dream, and so on.
Right, like different branches.
Well, just like, you know, you have a dream, different things happen in your dream over the night. One part of your dream is this thing that happens 20 years later. The other part of the dream is you're in the mall with some, you know, weird looking kids or something. Like, you know what I'm talking about? Like,
so you recognize parts of it, but it's as if the narrative is composed of chunks of the past and the future.
Well, the narrative might be gobbledygook, but since I can remember having dreamed it, it's very different than just the sensation of having dreamed it.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you've seen things in dreams that you later saw happen in reality and were able to remember that you previously dreamed it.
Yes, hundreds of times.
That's amazing. Do you have any explanation for how that might work?
Not really, but I do think about it. And what I usually think is something like, because, okay, one of the things that I often do then when I'm going through those things is, like when I'm experiencing something that I know I've dreamed in the past, is I try to see, depending on how it felt, if I can change it, or if I feel like I should change it. Get reality to take a different course than what happened in the dream. Now, sometimes when I do that, I find that by trying to change it, I produce the result that had occurred in the dream.
Right. So that's kind of a classic time travel paradox.
I suppose it is. Another thing that happens is I will try to change it, and even though I can change what I do, what other people do stays the same.
Right. Okay. Well, can I tell you about my experience that's sort of related to this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, this has only happened to me twice, but it was not a dream. So I was going about my day, doing normal things, talking to Sage, my wife, and I suddenly had a very intense deja vu like feeling, where it starts out as a simple deja vu where it's like, oh yeah, this feels like I feel like we've already been had this conversation, but it's not that. It's like, you know, this really intense deja vu. But then at some point, so it feels like deja vu for maybe 3 to 5 seconds, and then it changes, because then I suddenly am almost seeing and hearing what is currently happening and the way that it happened the other time. Or like, I think of it as like the first time I went through this loop, it was different. And in both times that this has happened to me, it was the thing that changed was we ended up having a pretty serious argument and got very angry and like left in a huff, and things were not great. And both times, as we got to this point where it was starting to become an argument, or it had, you know, kind of maybe started, but just barely started. And both times, my realization was, oh, wait a minute, I'm about to say this, and then she's going to say this, and then I'm going to say, and it gets bad. So I just didn't say the thing. So now I choose, I'm just not going to say that thing. So just shut up. And I'm now on a different timeline.
Yeah, well, I experience it as timelines too, because when I feel like I'm like what I sort of came to was this feeling like these things are the switch points where I can change tracks, like on a railway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I don't know if I can force a change another way, or if there's any reason to want to. Because it's like you just do, like with whether you realize it or not, you do what you would do.
But that's
normally.
the point, is I purposefully didn't do the thing that was natural for me to do.
Yeah.
And that I already remembered doing. And it's not
Right.
like, oh, I could do this. This was not foreknowledge. I'm not smart enough to be able to realize that if I say this stupid thing, it's going to cause this to happen. It wasn't that
No,
at all. It was,
no,
oh, I'm dumb enough to realize that I don't, like, I screwed this up and this is my chance to fix it. And I
no,
did
I'm
fix
crystal
it.
clear on all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely crystal clear on all that. Yeah. So, and what I'm saying is that often, like, my interventions in attempting to change tracks are just clumsy, because I don't actually know what to do. And I think that that's kind of the whole point. It's that, like, yeah, there's a certain kind of peace that I have to have with it if I don't know what to do. But if you
Yeah,
have
no, well, for me, it seemed like, I guess it makes the most sense to think that somebody, some greater power was telling me, hey, buddy, this is your chance to change this thing.
oh, that,
So,
yeah, and that would be my assumption.
yeah.
Yeah, or even if it's just that you have done it before and you know what happens, and you know that you'd rather have something else happen. Anything
Right. So
else.
it could be myself, my future self could be that outside power.
Sure, sure. And I mean, also, like, what is an inside power? What is an outside power? I feel like the harder that we look at those questions, the more they disappear. To attempt to define the inside and the outside of being.
Right. Okay. What about Jung? He does a lot of dream stuff.
Yeah, I haven't taken that much of an interest in him, partly because he's working with a theory of the unconscious that has to do with the commonalities between mythic structures. And I'm generally, like, Freud is also interested in the commonalities among mythic structures, which is how he comes up with his Oedipus complex, and other complexes that seem to conform to the structure of a classical myth. I do not regard those structures as necessary,
Right.
because I think the differences between mythic structures are as important as the similarities. Now, the similarities might show that human beings have things in common across different cultures and different times and so on. But I think the differences show that there are cultural differences that may operate at a psychological level. So, like, the Jung thing, to me, the logical conclusion of it is sort of the Joseph Campbell thing, where you flatten out the differences as much as possible. You could say, well, there's really just one super mythology that shows you the architecture of the human mind and of human culture, and that's why they're all basically the same. And again, I think the differences are as significant as the similarities.
For sure.
Not to show that one is, like, not to suggest one's better than another, or there are good ones and bad ones, or anything like this. Some are sophisticated and some are not. I'm not interested in any of that. I'm interested in the differences as such and what they might teach us.
Right. So the reason I bring Jung up is because of his interest in UFOs.
Oh, yeah. I didn't know about that.
Oh, yeah. So, okay. So his whole thing, these similarities and all, is basically comes down to the archetype, right?
Yes.
So basically he's saying, there's all these archetypes, and there's more than a dozen. There's a lot of them, and they can all combine in various ways. So there's actually a fairly complex way system, I guess, if you could call it that. But anyway, you're right. He's trying to simplify things, I guess, and sort of smooth out the wrinkles, like you said. But so even though he is consciously attempting to do that, and he's made choices throughout his career to really pursue these things. He then attempted to apply that to the UFO phenomenon, and he did so in a way that has been very misinterpreted by probably all of his followers. That, like, anyone that I've ever heard talk about it is really missing the point of what he said in the end, because he applied the archetype to the UFO, to ufology, and then realized that it didn't work. And how this happened was that essentially he tried to put it into subconscious terms, in that, UFOs are some kind of manifestation of a subconscious archetype that's somehow trying to reach out to your conscious level. It's interesting, but he could never really make it work. And the reason for that is because he actually went out and began to interview UFO witnesses. And so it's all well and fine to have theories about how things work, but when you talk to people who've seen it, you realize that your theories don't hold together so well. And this is what happened to Jung. So, so after doing a lot of work around the topic, and and writing about it fairly extensively, although in a rather fragmentary way, because his notes on UFOs are kind of spread throughout a whole bunch of his other literature. But the reason for that probably is due to this other fact, and that is, when he came to a certain point, he basically said, I was wrong. And he wrote a letter to, there's a series of letters between himself and someone else, I don't recall who it was, these correspondences about various things. I mean, these guys are always writing letters, right? So, and in one of these letters that I've seen a copy of the letter, he essentially says, and I won't get this verbatim, so I'm not going to try, but he essentially says, well, we thought that there was this, psychic, I'll use this word psychic, although I don't think he would use it. But there was this psychic phenomenon that we were investigating it, and trying to discern how such a thing could cause what appear to be hallucinations, and all this different kinds of experiential phenomenon. And so he's approaching it as a paraphenomenon that causes a phenomena. But at the end of the day, in this letter, he says, well, I wish I could tell you that such things were true, but like literally this theory just didn't pan out. And we have to conclude that there is something real that these people saw. And Jung admitted that. So basically all his other theoretical stuff around it was like, in the end, he said, yeah, just forget about all that shit, right? Like, nope, it's real. It's just a real thing.
A thing that happens. Yeah, well, even scientists eventually have to discard their pet theories if they don't hold water. So that's...
Well, I hope so. That, in my opinion, is what makes you a true scientist.
Well, yeah, certainly. It's an empiricist cornerstone. Yeah. So I that's interesting, Ken. Well, I definitely like there was nothing psychologically interesting about my experience, that's for sure. And my buddy, I don't think he has particularly this similar psychological wiring to my own, and he also, I mean, yeah,
Yeah, well, and okay, show me one time, anytime in all of history where group psychotic hallucinations is a thing. like, okay, you can use that as an explanation, but that's not a thing either. Like, why would you try to use something that doesn't exist to explain away something that you are trying to say doesn't exist?
Well, I mean, I've had a group hallucination.
Oh yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, me and a bunch of friends, my first time on acid, it was, let's see,
Well, on
me,
acid.
yeah, me, this
Well,
guy.
but it doesn't happen like without being on acid. Like
I found it strange enough that we hallucinated the same thing.
I mean, sure, that is strange, but that I actually don't find that unbelievable, because that goes back to many of these other I think that relates to some of the things that we've already talked about, especially the archetypal type of stuff, because there is commonality between the myths. And yeah, maybe that's not the most interesting part to you, but it is there. There is commonality. And so there has to be some underlying akashic field or some kind of group consciousness that connects minds. So
yeah, well, I mean, if you want to talk about psychological necessity, for me, it's actually pretty simple, which is that since we are created in God's image, we are similar to one another.
right. It's not like God created you in his image and then this other God created me in their image, right?
Right. So we're similarly created. So if we have similar psychic furniture, I accept that. But for, to me, like, the only part of it that's really fundamentally necessary is the existence of self and other. That as a self, we theorize another with whom we have an unpredictable encounter. And so this is Levinas, right? This is the philosopher that I'm interested in on that, because he uses the existence of an other, or the encounter with an unpredictable other, as the basis of an ethical theory, and as a grounding principle, ethics as first philosophy, rather than theorizing that there is an external world, theorizing that there is an other to whom and for whom we are responsible.
Okay, so basically saying if God could imagine an other, then therefore we are.
Right. We are God's other, and God is our other, and one another are each other's other as well. Sorting out who is whom, like, God, man, and animal are the sort of typical others. And you already have categories then, don't you?
Yeah.
The category of the animal is sort of like the other to whom we can do what we wish,
right.
for most human cultures.
Right. And so are most of the other humans, if they don't happen to live in my house or my country, or go to my church on Sunday, or blah 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 blah. Yeah, we're very tribal, right? We keep this tribalism.
It's also amazingly common in the history of rhetoric to represent the human other as an animal in order to justify treating them badly.
Or they're a barbarian, or they're a Democrat.
There's something deficient about them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can treat them as a superior treats an inferior, which is, of course, badly.